Global outsourcing. That is, Say's law in Keynesian style. Published by Quinterna n+1 number 28 in October 2010, translated by Balance Y. Avant. Capitalist production is extremely parsimonious of materialized labor, objectivized into commodities, while it is prodigal of men, of living labor, and squanderer not only of flesh and blood, but of nerves and brains, far more than any other mode of production. Indeed, it is only through the most monstrous squandering in individual development that the development of mankind is secured and realized in the historical epoch immediately preceding the conscious reconstitution of human society. Since the economy of which we speak here arises in all respects from the social character of labor, it is indeed to this immediately social character of labor that such a waste of life and health of the workers is due. Marx, The Capital, Book 3. The excess and squandering of the social labor of the proletarian class, in relation to the mass of products useful for consumption, gives a passive ratio tens of times worse than the ratio which for the individual wage earner runs between unpaid and paid labor, or the surplus value ratio, PC int, Property and Capital, 1948. The paradox of intensive exploitation. Jean-Baptiste Say, a French economist of the very early 19th century, argued that the mere fact of producing a commodity instantly opens the outlet to other commodities because the capitalist or wage-earning producer has no interest in retaining the money earned and necessarily buys other commodities. Marx was not tender with Say. Should money take longer than usual to find its outlet, the crisis would be certain, since the volume of the mass of commodities supplied by capitalist production is determined by its scale and by its own need for constant expansion, not by a predetermined circle of supply and demand, of needs to be satisfied. Capital, Book 2, Chapter 2.1. Treating complex socio-economic matters with the simple equation supply equals demand equals production equals consumption was also the mistake of Proudhon and later economists. The latter drew on Say and devised a law of outlets that has survived to the present day. In mathematics, by inverting factors, the output does not change, but in society, Marx ionized, if when it rains you open the umbrella, it is not enough to open the umbrella for it to rain. Keynes, while not accepting Say's law, nevertheless argued that by manipulating the factors of capital one could open the umbrella to make it rain. He was far too late. His theory was published in 1936, when fascism, already born under the reign of class clash, had opened the umbrella long ago, intervening heavily in the economy and social life by means of the state. Today everything has already been contrived and governments proceed to patch up the leaks while capital tries to find the infamous outlets for itself. Let us start from the principle that if there is waste of resources and dissipation of energies, as Marx says in the opening quote, there must be abundant resources and energies. There is no shortage in this society. The production of machines, plants, and commodities has reached paroxysmal proportions, and human and physical energies, blood, flesh, nerves, brains, steel, and oil, are called upon to participate so massively in the monstrous production cycle that the individual cells of which the overall organism of our species is composed in many cases rebel, become depressed, sick, and often kill themselves. And of course, the infernal production cycle takes advantage of this by generating an industry of rebellion, depression pharmacology, social welfare, and the cop in charge of controlling the stability of the system. On the one hand, it is about new material and immaterial production provided by companies that aim at profit, distribute wages, and contribute to the total value injected into society from scratch. On the other hand, it is a question of unproductive service paid for with a distribution of existing value, in the latter case, shares of wages and profit collected by the state and distributed according to more or less rational criteria, or shares of other people's value hoarded by piratical fringes of society capable of violently inserting themselves into traditional cycles or of creating alternative circuits of value plunder, speculation, under government, mafias, etc. Today, the statistics for a country with mature capitalism tell us that on average 2/3 of its inhabitants are of working age, that half are of employment potential, that 10% of this half are unemployed, and that 1/3 of this half are precariously employed. Italy deviates somewhat from the average in terms of employment liberation. Out of 60.4 million inhabitants, only 23 are employed, 10 million of them in a precarious or atypical manner, and 2 or 3 million are looking for work. It does not fare too badly against formidable competitors such as Germany, Japan, France, and the United Kingdom, but it is weak in industry, not least because its industrial proletarians are paid at Asian levels, at the exchange rate, about half that of Germany, and their wages make up the total value on which GDP is based. In general, however, it employs fewer people than the population, and each of them produces a higher share of GDP. It should be inferred that the GDP employment differential found in the comparison with Germany is all due to services, since agriculture is almost irrelevant, but it is hard to imagine that Italian services are more productive than German ones. The only possible explanation is that Italy cheats at cards. A large part of the millions of precarious workers in industry are among the employees of companies offering services, temporary agencies, cooperatives, etc. The gap is certainly also due to the age difference between Italian capitalism, which is 1,000 years old, and German capitalism, which is 200 years old, and in fact the recourse to external labor, contrary to what is commonly thought, is a very modern phenomenon of decadent capitalism. The reason for the gap between the USA and Germany is different. They are both capitalistically young countries, but the USA has reached a hegemonic imperialist position that has accelerated its senescence and financialization. Today, industry accounts for barely a fifth of US GDP. The difference between old and young capitalism can be clearly seen by comparing the various countries with China. Despite the persistent huge agricultural areas, the industrial share of China's GDP is almost 50% compared to 30% in Germany, 25% in Italy, and 20% in the US. This premise serves to draw attention not only to the inexorable march of all countries towards financialization and senility, but above all to the irreversible shift from the production of absolute surplus value through low wages and long working days to the production of relative surplus value through the application of science and technology to the labor process and its automation. In the composition of the market price of a Fiat car, the wages of the employees count for 8%, but at the same time all the surplus value of the said car is produced by the wage earner. Therefore the social distribution of value becomes an obligation imposed by a capital that does not know and cannot valorize itself in any other way. There is an ever-increasing need for relative surplus value, i.e. productivity, intensive exploitation, and it is precisely for this reason that the antidote represented by the growing sectors of absolute surplus value, productivity at parasitic level, extensive exploitation, is growing. More development equals more capital to exploit less labor power. It is in this passage that we specify what state capitalism really means. A rigorous definition is indispensable to understand the formation mechanisms of modern state policies that go so far as to nationalize about half of a developed country's economy. We have always stressed that capitalism in Italy was born state with the free communes and the maritime republics. Public power controlled capital even during the seigneuries of the Renaissance, and merchant leagues guaranteed and protected production and trade as much as states. From this phase, which has its roots in the Middle Ages and lasts until the Industrial Revolution exploded in Europe in the 19th century, capital is controlled by the state. With the end of the original accumulation, capital became autonomous, compare to n+1 number 17, 2005, and a reversal of positions took place. Now it is a capital as an autonomous and directing power that subjugates the state as its instrument. State capitalism proper is the last stage, not the first. In that stage, the quest for valorization becomes frenetic. There are no laws, borders, or armies that can stop capital seeking valorization in the globalized world. And governments bow to the markets, fear them, serve them, adapt their economic policies to them so that capital is attracted or even just stays where it is. In the growth phase of capitalism, this financial frenzy only manifests itself sporadically. An example, the famous 17th century speculation on Dutch tulips, and our current warned against the anti-Stalinist cliché about state capitalism in the USSR, preferring a state industrialism. A state that controls capital instead of being controlled by it is still at the stage of Colbert and his public manufactories, 17th century. In the US, it is decreasing the number of people employed and increasing the mass of profits. This means that it is increasing productivity, i.e. the rate of exploitation. But this does not at all mean that the profit rate, i.e. profit relative to anticipated capital, is also increasing. On the contrary, we know that the historical trend, which is international, is downward. Therefore, as ultra-modern capitalism conquers the world, the phenomenon predicted by Marx in Book 3 of Capital manifests itself ever more virulently. the development of the social productivity of labor expresses itself in a tendency towards a progressive fall in the rate of profit and, on the other hand, in a constant increase in the absolute mass of the profit hoarded, so that, on the whole, the relative fall in variable capital and profit corresponds to an absolute increase in both. This twofold effect can only be represented in an increase of total capital in a more rapid progression than that in which the rate of profit falls. In order to employ an absolute increase in variable capital, all other things being equal, total capital must grow not only in proportion to the increased composition, but even faster. It follows that the more the capitalist mode of production develops, the more it is necessary to increase capital in order to employ the same labor power. On a capitalist basis, the increasing productivity of labor thus of necessity produces a permanent worker overpopulation, Chapter 13. As we have seen, a country is more modern the more it frees up labor, not the more it employs. Let us take a good look at the figures we have brought up. In China 61% of the population works, in Germany 53%, in Italy 41%. According to Istat, the 30th of August, 2010, 15 million Italians of working age do not have a job and are not looking for one. Forget the facile cliché about slacker Italians, those who do not work nevertheless eat, both in the alimentary and figurative sense. It means that there is sufficient production of value to distribute to everyone, albeit obviously with peaks and troughs. It is no coincidence, therefore, that Italy is the industrial country with the most free labor force, i.e. with the highest number of precarious, atypical, unemployed and idle workers. A total of 12.5 million people are forced into non-work or part-time, poorly paid, slave labor. They are kept on the griddle by an uncertain situation, which makes life distressing and depressing. Both the local and global performance of the para-slavery system they are thrown into is extremely low. Instead of the old adversarial but market-driven relationship of commodity labor against wages at the right exchange value, today with short-term contracts there is a relationship bordering on sabotage against companies, as anyone who has dealt with services provided on the basis of extreme precariousness knows. But the margins for the individual capitalist are such, and the users are made so passive, that it is as if large parts of the territory act as a small domestic China. One of the counter-trends to the fall in the profit rate is to lower the organic composition of capital so as to extract more absolute surplus value from labor power. This involves placing highly automated production processes alongside areas of manufacturing where labor power can be exploited wildly, intensively and long into the working day. This is done either by relocating plants to young capitalist countries where conditions suitable for this purpose still exist, or by realizing, within developed countries, certain conditions capable of simulating those otherwise sought elsewhere. China stunned the world when it learned of a strike in a factory where 400,000 workers were concentrated, employees of a company, Foxconn, that employs 800,000 in all. These are numbers that we no longer find in the West, not least because they are socially scary. Better to break up the revolutionary class. In China it is still the state that controls capital, and the government can steer the establishment of private industrial giants to attract production from abroad. It is convenient for the multinationals, but in this way they skip the process of relocating factories and hand over production and a share of profits to the Chinese capitalists. In Italy, industry, services, and agriculture have at their disposal 10 million para-slaves to use in a large diffuse assembly line, made up of small and medium-sized production realities, but integrated in a coherent flow, often controlled by a holding company. The Fiat Group, for example, is the apex of a network of 1,100 companies, and could not even imagine a Chinese-style situation with 800,000 pissed-off metalworkers concentrated in one factory. So the 10 million para-slaves divided into small, connected production units with no union protection are just fine. It's like having a piece of the third or fourth world at home. The only trouble is that Italy has a low systemic performance because of an old, spineless, and screwed-up bourgeoisie that has never known what an industrial system is at government level, especially since the executive has been in the hands of a fixer-upper. The unemployment industry. China is therefore close, very close, so close that it is as closely connected to the West as communicating vessels are. Foxconn workers are striking for wage and regulatory improvements, while Western workers are striking not to lose what they have gained in the past. or at least they should, because they are annihilated by the terrorism of bosses and trade unions, both of which are completely subservient to the command of global capital. It's that or shut down. And the diktat doesn't make a wrinkle, because everyone knows that the factory is not a charity, it wants at least an average rate of profit. Thus, while China is slowly westernizing, the West is rapidly becoming Chinese, a process which, read in social terms, means lighting matches at random in the enormous powder keg of 1.5 billion wage earners in the world, 30% of whom are underemployed, to which one must add the formerly unemployed wage earners, who make up 12% of the world's population of working age, and an unspecified number of non-employed who are no longer looking for work and who therefore escape statistical observation. This is by no means a backward march of capital with respect to the ideological assumptions of the bourgeoisie that owns it, i.e. with respect to the ideas of democracy, progress, freedom, prosperity, and good company. Social productivity continues to grow and capital cannot help but extract more and more surplus value, being content with the increase in its mass as the wage declines. But to secure this kind of progress, capital must accentuate the distance between fine phrases and harsh reality, i.e. it must play side by side with that scientific factory, the Laissez factory, with the regulated labor market, the wild market, with the spheres of highly productive labor, the unproductive, parasitic, dissipative spheres. And the whole system meekly obeys, self-adjusting to this requirement. It is under these conditions that bogus branches of activity proliferate in the service of the system in an attempt to mitigate its senescence. On the one hand, technologies of exaggerated power with respect to the ends are adopted, only to then complain about the scarce utilization of the systems. On the other, permanent personnel are being reduced, replaced by a majority of precarious workers administered, or rather administered as the law states, by specialized outsourcing companies. New absolutely dissipative private apparatuses replace the employment offices, and in general the buying and selling of labor takes place as in the supermarket, where goods are displayed on the shelves waiting for the buyer. Parasitic activities such as those of offices that work only to deal with labor shortages, of consultants of all kinds, of lawyers for the conflicts generated by wild labor, increase disproportionately. Even motorized traffic intensifies as numerous workers, instead of producing within a factory, are forced to self-exploit in a continuous movement, trying to make ends meet and make the VAT number useful. Among trade unions, agencies, cooperatives, and various offices, the small mafia of training courses stands out. The scourge of unemployment grows, remedies are sought, the international need to coordinate them arises. In addition to local realities, the European Union allocates funds, and finally there are those who pocket them. Elementary. According to the latest Istat surveys, the number of Italians looking for work has risen to a record 2.3 million, and according to Confindustria, another 230,000 jobs will be burned by 2010. It is not the unemployed who benefit from the allocated funds but those who handle these funds, and in recent years cases of fraud have increased fivefold. Thousands and thousands of hours of training with no real job outlets have fed a system that attracts 20 billion euros of public funding every year, 10,000 euros for each unemployed person, 8,000 with the new figures. Some bourgeois economists see black and issue stern warnings fearing the future effects of an unproductive economy that feeds itself, growing on itself. But all he can do is observe it as one does in a laboratory with the evolution of a bacterial colony or in a hospital with the progression of cancer metastases. We will cite below an example of a social Darwinian mechanism of the praxis of the outlets by which capital seeks to minimize the fall in the profit rate. This is an episode of which we have direct knowledge, but which is absolutely generalizable. After all, this article is also written to describe a historical environment, i.e. one that has a dynamic over time, the current one, in which increasingly fierce exploitation manifests itself and which is the premise for an equally fierce distribution of value both between and within classes. It is only from the historical relationship between them and the mode of exploitation that the meaning of immediate or trade union struggle can be deduced. This will become increasingly clear. Of course, we have always participated and participate in every trade union struggle as it is, but this does not prevent us from reiterating that we believe it is necessary to derive from revolutionary theory the characters of what the immediate struggle should be. This is not wishful thinking, but the natural development of the great tactical questions discussed within the proletarian movement since its beginnings, especially after the founding of the Third International, within which our current has been fighting since 1920. The corporate social monster. Venice 2009 to 2010. A few dozen young precarious workers employed on an occasional basis at the biennial participate in 2-week training courses organized by Adecco and the biennial itself, financed by the bilateral agency Formatemp, among the lecturers, also trade unionists. These young people, precarious, unemployed, but not stupid, immediately grasped the meaning of the operation. The students are not paid, but the rest of the shanty is self-supporting with its raison d'etre, i.e. the existence of the unemployed themselves, who are verbally promised a contract of employment. At the end of the course, only a few of them are offered a 3-day contract, the majority nothing. The discontent finds vent in a strike from which a small network of contacts via email springs up. Circulating among the precarious workers is a comment along the following lines. The dispute in the biennial shows how it is possible to set up, despite the extreme difficulty of union and communication between atypical workers, an apparently dead-end claim action, when germs of social polarization begin to be generated and give rise to an embryonic network of spontaneous communication. It becomes feasible both to organize a strike that was previously unthinkable and to arrive, thanks to the connection with other working realities, at the idea of a coordination between workers in the same conditions. The most frightening fact, and yet normal nowadays, is the inextricable intertwining of the interests of the subjects the workers have to deal with, cooperatives and agencies that supply more or less precarious workers, commissioning bodies that are deliberately distracted with respect to temporary, or contracted workers, politicians who pounce on the struggle to carve out scraps of visibility, public administrators caught up in the double role of employer counterparts and fake supporters of the workers' reasons. This is only the beginning. The inextricable tangles will prove to be a real social monster that is absolutely unproductive, in which all levels of consultation are implicated, from the entities that employ the workforce to those that manage to administer it, from the municipality to the region, from the state to the pseudo-alternative fringes of current activism. A coordination involving workers from different service areas was born. Within it there are some grassroots trade unionists who at first seem convinced that they control the situation, but soon come into conflict with the workers and abandon it. The contacts spread to other realities, such as the University of Ca Foscari, where 53 workers were left at home by a contracting cooperative. In May 2010, in a meeting of which the workers are notified after the fact, the union sign a ceasefire agreement with the Biennale accepting a drastic reduction in staff and a decrease in the number of hours. The coordination immediately denounced the fact, demanding that the signature be withdrawn. In the meantime, the workers note that the trade unionists who signed the agreement immediately switched to the other side, i.e. to the bilateral tourism board for the Venice area, an institution provided for by the new contractual model, which sees the bosses and the trade union bureaucracy sitting at the same table to manage a series of rules and funding, arbitration, recruitment, training courses, etc., in a corporatist manner. The signing of the agreement without the knowledge of the seasonal workers, a method, its contents, a merit, and the network of interests that binds institutions, cooperatives, unions, and companies detonate a second round of mobilizations. The CGIL announces the withdrawal of its signature and protests against the cutting of seasonal staff for the Biennale exhibitions. The decision was taken after a fiery workers' assembly that highlighted how the agreement betrays previous agreements, already signed with the Biennale to protect precarious personnel. But that plot we have just described as a social monster takes revenge. After 2 months of assemblies and coordinated initiatives, the workers found themselves faced with a second Capestro agreement. The season of public events was about to begin. The Biennale management knew full well that it was dealing with the aforementioned tangle of interests and did not compromise, and the CGIL finally pushed the workers to accept an agreement that was a photocopy of the one that had been cancelled. Through the coordination, the workers themselves denounced the plot, making it public on the internet and pointing out that the mayor, vice president of the Biennale and mediator between the various social components, is co-responsible for the scam. It is easy to understand why the number of precarious workers is practically halved. They will be joined by cultural mediators, a new professional figure experimented for the first time in Turin and immediately adopted in Venice, a city museum, the most appropriate to receive the deal, the plethora of university students will have an outlet in the underpaid or more often free work of cultural institutions. Since students are extra contracted figures on loan, they are easily conned with the devious reference to their culture, and thus easily adaptable to modern optimized slavery. At least the ancient slave had to be fed even when not working. The circle closes. The interests of the managers of the entities or companies that use labor are easily integrated with those of the entities or companies that manage the labor market. Trade unions, intermediaries, and public structures sit at the same consultation tables. Capital is delighted. Many unproductive public services, once fed by a share of the national value produced elsewhere, profits and wages, are now part of a parasitic undergrowth that has gone into businesses, has corporatized itself and therefore produces wages and profits itself. The total balance would not change were it not for the fact that never before has quantity turned into quality. A reservoir of 12 million unemployed, precarious and variously enslaved out of not even 25 million employed have a devastating impact on the labor market, an impact that enhances the whole picture of conflicting causes with respect to the law of falling profit rates. And there is quite a search for the perpetrators of all this, even if the sneering masked anarchist from V for Vendetta were to blow up the entire gang of parasitic exploitative criminals with his pyrotechnics, nothing would change. The system can only be undermined if the wage earners are able to recompose their now shattered strength, that is, to recompose their class network, which now as never before cannot, and must not, be by trade or workplace but territorial, by simple class membership. The trade union has tried to address this issue, but has failed completely. Rigidly structured as a parastatal bureaucracy by trade categories, it is not equipped to deal with the atomization of the precariat. The CGIL has created the NIDL, New Labour Identities, which is, however, an empty box, thus the worker has no choice but to open individual disputes, for which, however, there are hardly any certain legal grounds. As we wrote in the last issue about the living conditions of the proletariat, variations are continuous and solutions discontinuous. If today the eliminated working time is despair and uncertainty that force the worker into the macabre ritual of begging for something that is no longer there, tomorrow the worker himself will participate in the elimination of something that is still there, i.e. the working time that has not yet been transformed into living time. In the capitalist form, for the worker, selling labor power is not just a way of living, but the way, if it gradually proves impossible to perpetuate this, if the era of claims ends, the explosion of class confrontation at the highest level is inevitable. Service as a paradigm of today's capital. For Marx, productive labor is that which immediately generates surplus value, i.e. which valorizes capital through the process of productive consumption of labor power. The concept is found everywhere he deals with the subject, but this definition is taken from the unpublished Chapter 6 of Book I. It is followed by some fundamentally important considerations on what happens when the environment is one of relative surplus value extraction, i.e. when we have moved from the formal subsumption of labor to capital to real subsumption. For Marx, capitalism, having reached this stage, is no longer a hybrid society. It brings with it fragments of old social forms, but makes the extraction of relative surplus value dominant. The real subsumption of labor to capital is accompanied by a complete revolution in the mode of production itself, in the productivity of labor, and in the relation between capitalists and workers. It is with this revolution that we have entered the specifically capitalist mode of production. Now the true functioning of the total labor process is no longer based on the individual worker, albeit multiplied thousands of times over, but on an increasingly socially combined labor force, Marx himself points out. The coordinated activity of the various partial workers, or rather, wage earners participating in the production process, constitutes the total machine, where everyone participates with different functions, from worker to manager, from engineer to overseer, from laborer to technician. In short, an increasing number of functions of the labor force are grouped together, providing productive labor as a whole. The factory is then a collective worker whose combined activity produces a total mass of goods, in the face of which the function of the individual partial worker is completely indifferent. But what happens to the total worker also happens to capital and its productive machine. The totality of industries and service companies is no longer just the reservoir of the collective worker mentioned above, but the total machine. And in fact Marx, with admirable anticipation, envisages it as a complete system, total factory, collective worker or global worker, and, as a product, a shapeless mass of commodities that can be treated as a single commodity, no longer discrete but continuous, like in his time the railway, the telegraph, water and gas, and today radio, television, energy, the internet, bills, rents, insurance, health service deductions, all transactions that are nothing more than discretized payments for a continuous service, the realization and sale of which almost no longer need the partial worker bound to the workplace, but the global, fluid, undifferentiated worker. The ultra-capitalist refinement of the figure of the worker linked to total capital can be glimpsed in the institution of the work voucher, at the moment managed by the INPS and limited to occasional work, but well configurable as a specular process that in the face of the service company gives rise to the figure of the service worker. There is nothing strange or new in this. The process has its own invariant with respect to Marx, and indeed his own anticipations confirm this. Only that capital completely autonomous and the worker completely liberated from the buying and selling of his labor power represent the last stage beyond which there can be nothing but the new society. If the political transition has been ready since at least 1871, from a practical point of view today, we are already at forms of transition, albeit crushed by the persistence of capitalism. The work voucher instituted by the Baerjee law is only minimally part of the formation of total value, but it is significant that for the first time it was devised and introduced within the general process of decapitalization of capitalist society. Theoretically, if we do not consider the finiteness of the planet, which in itself denies the possibility of infinite growth, the mechanism of capitalist accumulation can be represented with an equilibrium equation, as long as the organic composition of capital does not change. With the guaranteed rate of profit, a part of the profit is added to the original capital, which is enhanced, and the cycle proceeds incrementally, allowing the wage to be satisfied with growth as well. And that is what actually happened. For capitalists this is unfortunate because growth means an increase in the quantity of commodities, and therefore among capitalists there is a race to increase production without at the same time increasing the existing parameters of plant, machinery, raw materials, and energy. Wages can also increase, since by definition they are totally transformed into commodities useful for the reproduction of labor power. This is the death trap. An increase in production with fixed costs means a decrease in the unit value of goods. If a capitalist succeeds, he will sell at the usual price and pocket a differential profit. Normally the game is short-lived because of competition. As soon as other capitalists have to behave in the same way, the whole system will find itself with more goods at a lower unit value, but also at a lower price because of market leveling. As a result, the individual capitalist is pushed to innovate, which means to go and change the condition we had set to have an equilibrium equation, i.e. to change the organic composition. And since everyone will be forced to act this way, etc., etc. This hellish process is well known, but it was useful to recall it in order to reach a conclusion about capitalism in its advanced stage of decomposition. The history of capitalist accumulation unfolds precisely in various stages, two above all, which we have already mentioned, that of the formal subsumption of labor to capital and that of real subsumption. Today we are obviously interested in the latter. It is characterized by the explosion of productivity, which increases as a function of the increase in organic composition. But it is characterized above all by incessant production, i.e. the incessant placing of an increasing number of commodities on the market. Number of goods, therefore discrete quantities, each of which is subject to natural decrease in value and sooner or later, but always quickly, in price. The ideal commodity is therefore the continuous commodity already mentioned by Marx, possibly produced under a monopoly regime, or cartel between monopolies, which is then that peculiar to the imperialist epoch. Service is the phenomenal form of the continuous commodity. When you buy a car, you have a discrete commodity that will deliver its use value for the time stipulated by the designer on the basis of market research. After that you have to replace it with another one, perhaps cursing those who had already managed to charge for the maintenance service in coupons anyway. If you lease the car you get a continuous service and you also have the benefit of not having to go all the way to scrap. The factory sells, the mediating company takes its bribe and the user pays handsomely for the service, if he can. There is no specific convenience, but the sales argument is attractive. Among the usage values being touted would be convenience, full insurance, driving sans soucis, the public service and its productive related activities. Social leasing is more complex because of very effective intrinsic mechanisms that make the propagation of the system much faster and more massive. Apart from publicity, no one can induce someone else to opt for car leasing instead of the traditional purchase, but if by chance someone is an alderman in a region on behalf of a party that controls a trade union whose official is director of a cooperative or president of a bilateral social management body, then it is very likely that he will induce the municipality to use the outsourcing services of that cooperative, or of a firm that administers labor or provides the direct service, etc., which will grow in size and become more influential on other aldermen, and so on until the social leasing system becomes more complex because of the intrinsic mechanisms that make its propagation much faster and more massive, which will grow in size by becoming more influential on other councillors, and so on until an inextricable network of interests is configured. Blame corruption? Well, it is not the best to analyze a phenomenon starting from the effects instead of the causes. The councillor is part of a system fueled by the capital's need to enhance itself. The petty thug is just the last wheel on the wagon. Keynes' joke is well known: if a guy marries his housekeeper, the gross domestic product suffers. Free domestic work for oneself and one's family is, of course, not counted for GDP purposes, whereas paid domestic work is. The GDP only counts added value, which, apart from the way it is calculated, should correspond to our V plus P, wages plus surplus value. Theoretically, it should not count unproductive labor, and in fact non-market services result as a distribution, through the tax mechanism, of added value produced elsewhere. Public schools, the police, the army, the judiciary, etc., are services that consume without producing. If they were all privatized, absolutely nothing would happen from a macroeconomic or total value production point of view, even if the eventual government that decided to privatize could boast of having lowered taxes. It would be a big joke, because the citizen would pay to the private sector what he used to pay to the state, but that is how politics works. Privatizing the public service is like taking away the motorist's insurance and making him pay for the damage when he has an accident. Spreading the risk, expense, or benefit over a social average is the result of every civilization, ancient and recent, that has needed roads, aqueducts, or amphitheaters. Capitalism in its last stage, i.e. the demo-fascist form, had perfected the public system by integrating many functions, from insurance to railways, from energy to factories, from information to entertainment. So-called privatization in nations where the most liberal state controls 50% of the economy anyway seems like nonsense, but in the light of the mechanisms of accumulation, there is plenty of sense. It is precisely the immense productive squandering, the inhuman dissipation, that this society seeks like drowning people seek a lifebelt. In fact, since the end of the Second World War, a lot has been nationalized and not a damn thing has been privatized. The parasitic distribution of unproductive services has simply been nationalized, making them become productive as if by magic, as if Keynes's wife had suddenly become a salaried governess, leaving aside the creepy conception of the female function in society. The visible profit of private capital gives the illusion that it increases the general profit, but when the sums are drawn at the macroeconomic level, it turns out that the GDP instead stalls, while the whole of society sees the chaos due to the anarchy of Darwinian enlarged reproduction increase. The GDP is a perverse macroeconomic parameter. If economic and social chaos increases, people get restless, dissipate more, increase unnecessary traffic, get warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer, get sick, die, commit crimes, disrupt the land by flooding, rebuild. In short, they engage in additional activities that drive up both the infamous gross domestic product and individual anguish. Ours is not a stand for a public service and against a private service. Capitalism does not change one iota, even if the old public management of telephones, electricity, gas and railways produced less confusion, hype and disservice. However, it is necessary to demystify, the deregulation that has been fashionable since the Thatcher-Reagan duo is by no means a destatalization of capitalism. Capital imposes privatization or nationalization on the state when needed, indifferently. In both cases it is the state that decides the rules, maneuvers the flow of capital or issues money to stimulate or save private enterprise. We live in the age of state capitalism, full stop. With this in mind, there are many privatizable services, and we need to limit ourselves to significant examples. One of the self-feeding mechanisms of services that allow an outlet for capital in search of valorization is the prison system, which is being privatized in many countries. 9 million prisoners in the world represent an imprisonment rate of 1.3 people for every 1,000 who inhabit the planet, including women, old people, and children. The example among examples is certainly the United States, whose penitentiaries house 2.4 million inmates, about 0.8 for every 100 inhabitants, 1 for every 100 adults, 1 for every 31 adults if we count all those who have an open account with the correctional system, 60% blacks or immigrants. Americans, made schizoid by an unbearable society, commit comparable crimes in numbers certainly higher than the average of other countries, but they are certainly not out-of-touch aliens who deserve to be incarcerated 5 times more than the British, 9 times more than the Germans, 10 times more than the Italians, 12 times more than the Japanese, and so on. In 1970, just for comparison, 1 out of every 400 adult citizens was imprisoned, but the crimes had not been proportionately fewer. Something must evidently have happened to inflate the system. An association of American jurists tried to summarize the perversion of the judicial system in the USA in 3 points. 1. It locks up too many people for too long. 2. Under the pretext of security it arbitrarily criminalizes behavior that the law as such does not consider criminal. 3. The overlapping of state and federal laws makes the system unpredictable, so much so that an ordinary citizen does not know whether he is breaking the law or not in certain cases. It does not seem that these jurists have arrived at much. The banality of the 3 points suggests that the prison system has evolved in complete autonomy. With everything upstream a judicial power, and downstream, private industrialization of the prison system, American capitalism is fine with this. If we disregard, arbitrarily, the terrorist function of social control, we see that the economic function is not indifferent and that the corporatist management of the prison gives much satisfaction to private capital. Just multiply the minimum cost to inmate, state of Mississippi, $18,000 per year, by the number of inmates and we obtain the absolute revenue of the sector that the private capitalist could transform into turnover from which he could make a minimum profit. Multiplying instead the maximum cost to inmate of the Californian super-technological prisons, $50,000 per year, by the number of inmates, we have the hypothetical pool of what is now the differential rent that can be transformed into turnover and maximum profit. Therefore, within American society, in the prison field alone, there is the possibility of distributing surplus value to the tune of $125 billion, a differential income in power distributed in a hail of sunshine among companies that see it as turnover from which to make a profit. This approach does not seem strange. In capitalist society, whoever pockets the surplus value of others appropriates an annuity that he can make use of as he wishes, even by opening a company. Once the contract has been signed, the prison capitalist receives a share of the surplus value raked into the company through taxation from the state, on an exclusive, thus monopolistic basis. Even a traditional company can take advantage of an annuity position. Today Fiat receives subsidies from the state on a par with its competitors, he says, but when in the 1950s it produced under a monopoly regime, our current claimed that it was collecting annuities because its surpluses were a share of the mass of total surplus value, production volcano. If then, instead of guarding and re-educating prisoners, one simply makes them work, then the business is amplified. Perhaps globalizing. Lockhart Technologies Incorporated of Austin, Texas, closed its U.S. facilities, laid off its employees and opened a factory in Australia using concessionary prison labor. The state of Arizona is planning a private prison in Mexico for 2,000 Chicano inmates who will be the workforce of local maquiladoras. These are borderline cases with globalized relocation. In any case, prison labor is also very much in demand locally, especially by companies that produce equipment for the armed forces, but also by those that produce other goods or provide services, especially call centers. One understands, then, the reason for the activism shown by private prison lobbies in lobbying state and federal agencies to maintain a zero tolerance, i.e. maximum increase in prison population and facilities. Incidentally, the number of American prisoners actually locked up is 60% more than the maximum capacity envisaged in the prison building plans, so there is sufficient margin for specialized, state-funded, and therefore very lucrative construction activity on top of everything else. And this despite the fact that in the last 20 years, 1,100 new prison facilities have already been built, 160 private companies have sprung up in 30 states, and the turnover of the entire system is growing at a staggering rate of 35% per year. California has 32 penitentiaries, 21 of which were built from 1990 onwards with technological inmate control criteria. Among them, in the early 1990s, the largest in the world, the Pelican Bay State Prison, for 170,000 prisoners controlled and managed by 1,400 employees, partly state-owned and partly from private contractors. It has no fences, only electronic sensors, and even the inmate's entire life is punctuated by more or less invasive equipment, capable of monitoring his heartbeat, blood pressure, and even the release of adrenaline if by chance he should think of escaping or disturbing himself by getting excited. All this produces a prison industry with capitalists and wage earners, in which dollars circulate, constant capital is consumed and labor is supplied. One can see how total capital can take a breather. Prison can also be an interstate business. Holland has an exuberant prison building, while Belgium's is deficient, so The Hague rents to Brussels, for €30 million a year, 500 cells for its prisoners, guarded by Dutch staff with a Belgian director. On the other hand, even the immigrant lagers scattered around the world, but especially in Europe and Africa, are already managed with international agreements that also provide for financial compensation. Spies and mercenaries, self-replicating Keynesians. State inflation. This was the title of 2 articles in our current published in 1949. Inflation in the sense of something that inflates, that is pumped up like a balloon. An expanding state occupies space by definition, taking space away from other subjects, both territorially and economically, a field in which the latter, far from being a mere cost, is good for the GDP, allows value to be distributed and thus stimulates consumption. In Italy, there are 3.5 million public employees, 6% of the population, in line with the average in France, Germany, and Great Britain. In the United States, they are proportionally somewhat more, 19 million out of 300 million inhabitants, 6.3%. The difference between the USA and other countries lies in the police military apparatus, which alone employs 5 million people, 2.5 in the armed forces, 1.7 in the police, 0.8 in intelligence. General Eisenhower, in his farewell speech as President of the United States, 1961, acknowledged that a military-industrial complex had formed, which had become autonomous from civil society. It is clear that he was referring to the power of the Pentagon lobbies and industries intertwined with the political powers and thus able to influence governments, but we have already approached this characteristic of autonomization from another angle, that is, we have attributed it not so much to bad politics as to capital that bends politics to its inescapable demands. When the Oklahoma City bombing took place in 1995, with 168 dead and 800 injured, there was already a liberal America denouncing the growing pressure of lobbies on the security question. With the attack on the Twin Towers on the 11th of September, 2001, the inflationary process of the state security apparatuses became completely autonomous. We quote some figures from an inquiry of the Washington Post available on the newspaper's website. Together with an impressive database with information on the entire American spy system, we note in passing this confirmation of the Times, the denunciation campaigns that Lenin hoped for Iskra, the counter-information of today's alternatives, is now common practice of bourgeois newspapers in the war between factions within the ruling class. There are 1,271 government security organizations, flanked by 1,931 private companies. Government employees number 854,000 and are based at 10,000 operational bases, i.e. more or less visible offices or entire buildings, on American soil alone. Productivity is not great, 50,000 intelligence reports per year, so 1 report for every 20 officials. Since the annual budget is $75 billion, each report costs $1.5 million. Even the head of the CIA has officially acknowledged that this is a bit too much. The apparatus to be controlled has ended up appointing its own controllers. It has at the top a coordinating office and a director general who answers to the executive, i.e. to the White House, but this director, who is the head of the CIA, has declared, also officially, that in the whole universe there is only one entity that can know what goes on in such an apparatus, God. Now, since the operatives, i.e. the spies in the field, are complaining about the overdose of information. The NSA, which deals with telematic intelligence, sifts through 1.7 billion emails, phone calls, faxes, etc. every day. Another office has been opened to select from 20 agencies and 63 internet sites the information to be passed on to the interested parties. It is not impossible that a further office will be opened tomorrow to control the new office of selectors. The enemy opposes this apparatus with the simple rejection of eavesdropping technologies. For example, Al-Qaeda has less than 300 permanent militants who consume little, communicate by voice and stay away from electronic gadgets and traceable networks. For the surveillance of the enemy's bank movements there are 51 departments with offices in 15 metropolises. Having the specific task of reconstructing the flow of suspicious capital, they will certainly devote themselves to monitoring the flow of capital to determine which of it is suspicious. Thus the spies kill two birds with one stone by monitoring not only terrorists but also capitalists in competing states, and sometimes, working on their own, they turn their attention to the interior of the states. The instilling of security needs is no small business. Since 9/11, 263 new apparatuses have been set up, and there is no difference between the copish activism of the Bush administration and that of the Obama administration. Significantly, the first installment of the Washington Post's investigation was entitled, "A Secret World Grown Out of Control." Secret it is, but why out of control? It is obvious to us, out of control is that which has become autonomous with respect to man's ability to govern. And in fact, the overdose of information produces disinformation, so that real secrecy, that of documents stamped top secret like in 007 movies, has become a random element, since entire branches of the spy services are contracted out to the highest bidder. The contractor is the non-plus-ultra of achievements due to autonomized capital. In its purest form it is a bit like the problem solver in pulp fiction. It has no factory, no offices, no workshops, no machines of its own. It uses the client's facilities and tools or rents or buys them and then resells them after depreciation, charging them to the same client. He should have at least some liquid capital to advance raw materials, energy, wages, but for a long time now he has been discounting the mere fact that he has a job order to the bank, providing himself with borrowed money, which he in any case charges to the client like the rest. Now that the money is obtained at almost zero cost due to the now chronic state incentives, the contractor enjoys an advantage over the competition. What is more, it is able to manipulate the final prices at will through its lobbies, and above all to spread an accounting fog in front of the tax authorities through cascading subcontracts. This applies to the field of large public works, power stations, motorways, railways, as well as to the small cooperative that provides the cleaning service. But it is when all these relations are taken care of by public bodies and the state that capitalism breathes the best oxygen, the rates of remuneration touch the maximums, and the overspend falls indirectly on other classes, in the smallest part on that of property owners and smallholders, in the greatest part on the poor and proletarian, property and capital. What kind of state is an organism of domination that outsources its safety net to private companies? Is it not a veritable slave of capital if it also contracts out the ultimate expression of its power, i.e. its armed force? There is clearly no limit to the autonomization of total capital. There was a time when states had their own national arsenals, a military general staff in which members of the ruling class, trained in nationalist militarism in patriotic academies, participated directly, a rigid pyramid structure to whose command an army of the people was consigned. Today, global outsourcing, the child of autonomized capital, expands from factories and the more or less productive service sector to the characteristic sectors of class domination. It is futile to seek a rational explanation for the phenomenon, which not only takes delicate activities away from central control, but is utterly dissipative. The only explanation lies in the irrationality of the spontaneous functioning of capitalism, which has to translate everything into commodities, including security and war. Not only in the sense that the apparatuses of these sectors oversee the manufacture of prisons, electronic office and facility equipment, weapons of all kinds, etc., but in the sense that the service rendered becomes itself a commodity, reflecting, just like any other commodity, the very modern ambiguity of use-value. In fact, it no longer matters that the commodity satisfies a human need, because today's need, whether it comes from the belly or from the imagination, as Marx put it, is closely linked to compulsive consumption, whether of the individual or of society does not matter. The end of the post-war boom and the Cold War meant the unraveling of the old military apparatus based on the conscript soldier. It is estimated that this has resulted in 6 million unemployed people entering the labor market. Among them, officers and specialists in various capacities have been good vehicles for channeling capital in new directions. Mercenaries have always existed, but now they have begun to be quoted on Wall Street with their own companies, private military companies, PMCs, specializing in war operations, often on behalf of the official armies that delegate the dirty work to private contractors so as not to raise political problems. In Iraq, the ratio of soldiers to contractors was at its highest in 2007, 130,000 against 160,000, more mercenaries than soldiers. In total, there were 1.5 million soldiers. We do not know how many mercenaries. When earlier this year the US government ordered to step up the commitment in Afghanistan in view of the withdrawal from Iraq, the bases with 50,000 men remained anyway. There were 68,000 regular soldiers and 104,000 mercenaries in the pay of private paramilitary companies. The arrival of 33,000 additional soldiers has led to a more than proportional increase of mercenaries, 56,000 from the United States and the rest recruited partly abroad and partly on the spot, so much so that the Afghan puppet president has repeatedly protested about the vampire-like presence of this mass of parasites, including the NGOs, which, although denouncing the situation in some rare cases, for the most part do nothing but self-reproduce themselves by objectively sharing in the spoils. And the continuous massacre of civilians. The reported figures include armed mercenaries, generally used for garrisons, training, escorts, prison camp management, prisoner interrogation, etc., and civilian employees recruited by paramilitary organizations for their own services, or by the US government for general services needed by the occupation army. Excluded from the count are thousands of mercenaries hired directly by private companies, not PMCs, for security tasks. Adding up government procurement and private recruitment results in a mass contracting that creates a local supply industry of considerable size compared to the economy of the occupied countries, so that the establishment of a military corps becomes analogous to that of any industry. It is certainly not accurate to say that the US has privatized war or contracted it out. War remains a state affair. But of a state that has to pander to the needs of capital without being able to put its foot down, even if only to impose a little order, to smooth over the exaggerated waste. The Iraq War, reads a study by economist Joseph Stiglitz, has cost more than $3 trillion so far. This certainly includes the costs for soldiers of an army that is no longer conscripted, especially for those who have died and those who have been wounded, compensation to families and pensions for veterans, the aforementioned mercenaries, and above all the companies on which they depend weigh heavily. The expenditure for the construction and maintenance of the immense military bases is not indifferent. But at the end of the day, beyond the individual movements, the cost of the war, 22% of the American GDP, corresponds to an equal amount of capital that otherwise would not have been channeled into productive sectors, and which instead found its own outlet in sectors strongly intertwined with public commissioning, capable of guaranteeing value. An enormous transfer of value within society, but a very high net profit for the individual paramilitary companies and those of the other war services. Not to mention the fact that, within the first-level autonomization of capital, which has become anonymous and global, a second-level autonomization occurs, involving mercenary groups dedicated to activities in their own right such as the international trafficking of arms, drugs, and, as was the case in Iraq and Afghanistan, of women for prostitution. The plot becomes universalized and even the military network ends up connecting with all the others, including the mafias, powerful estates, the true representatives of ultramodern globalization. Looking at a few empirical examples, we have come to lift some of the veils that cover general distribution relations. Veils that contribute to mystifying the true relationship, which is that of the production of surplus value, which, with wages, is the source of all possible income. Therefore, for capital there are no long-term loopholes. It can develop the jungle of value distribution as long as it wants, deceiving itself about the source of local profit, but it is the production of global value that counts. Having reached a certain degree of maturity, the historical, capitalist, form is dropped and gives way to a higher form. That the time has come for such a crisis can be seen as soon as the contrast between the distribution relations, hence also between the historically determined form of the production relations corresponding to them, and the productive forces on the other hand, gains in breadth and depth. A conflict then arises between the material development of production and its social form of Marx, Capital, Book 3, Chapter Li.